welcome to another adventure in Australian literature and a whole new year. So welcome to 2024 with Black Cockie Press. So we're starting 2024 with actually a book that we want to continue a theme throughout this year, which is books that deal with the early settlement of Australia. So we are starting out the year with Richard Flanagan's Gould's Book of Fish. But before we start, as always, remember there is our shop with books and writing services, and it's 2024, so we're going to have some new books this year, so keep your eye out for them. There is also our Redbubble shop with lots of designs. There's over 100 different designs on there now, and more will come. Also, please like, subscribe, share the videos, leave a comment. Love reading comments when they're polite. If they're not polite, Her Infernal Majesty deals with them. We figure she has fun with that. We figure it's better that way. That's all the housekeeping. And here is this week's book. I hope this the cover of this isn't too green. Gould's Book of Fish. Gould's Book of Fish is the story of Sid Hammett and William Bulow Gould, Billy Gould. Sid Hammett is a contemporary 21st century, because this is a 2002 publication. He is a furniture forger, and he makes he forges antique furniture. He's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And he finds this book hidden in the bottom of an old wardrobe. The book purports to be the authentic diary of William Bulow Gould, who was a convict on Sarah Island and who actually painted fish. He was a forger and a thief, and when he was transported to Sarah Island in Tasmania, I think that's on the west coast. I'm not 100% certain. I think it is west coast of Tasmania anyway. He is ordered, I would say commissioned, but that implies he has freedom in this choice here, to paint a book of fish. We have Gould's Book of Fish. This is how we know him. Again, we have, so this book, this is not my original copy. The original copy that I had colour plates in it. This is the reprint of it. I have a interesting relationship with Richard Flanagan in terms of as a reader. I'll talk about that in a bit. But in the front of the book, you have the 12 fish that make up the narrative. These are all actual fish from Gould's Book of Fish. The seahorse here on the front is also from Gould's Book of Fish. So what Flanagan does is we have this framing narrative of the contemporary finding of the diary, and then we go into the diary. As we read the diary, we realise this is an impossible document. This cannot exist. It is supposedly written from blood and filth in the saltwater cell of the condemned in Sarah Island, where Billy Gould is telling his story. And what he tells is this fantastical, outrageous, insane story of Sarah Island, of this colony. It is a book about telling stories. It's a book about authenticity. It's a book about who gets to tell stories. And it's a book about the early settlement of Tasmania, which is different to the early settlement of New South Wales, which is different to the early settlement of Victoria, which is different to the early settlement of Queensland. Every single state has this early settlement story, and they are all different. There is not one singular narrative that comes out of Australia, because it is the separate colonies that would make up Australia at Federation all have different and unique histories. This one is talking about Tasmania. So he's a Tasmanian telling a Tasmanian story. So this influences the kind of story he tells. The other books that we're going to have a look at, I believe, are all New South Wales writers. No, one is a Queenslander. One's David Malouf. We're going to have a look at David Malouf. We're going to have a look at Thomas Keneally, and we're going to have a look at Kate Grenville. So I'm not going to tell you which books exactly, but those are the writers we're going to have a look. So we're going to have a look at a couple of New South Wales writers and also Queenslander. This is the Tasmanian one. We have actually also had a look at Western Australia with That Dead Man Dance, which is unique among these because it is from an Indigenous perspective. It's the Swan River settlement in Western Australia from an Indigenous perspective. So again, there are multiple different ways of telling these stories. And that is the point of this book. This book is, in terms of style, is really interesting. It is a postmodern novel. It is a parody. So the layout of the book itself is very much parodying and harking back to Daniel Defoe. When you look at something like Robinson Crusoe or Moll Flanders or any Daniel Defoe, the way that they're laid out, the chapters are laid out, and at the beginning of the chapter it will tell you herein is this, and this, which makes it really easy to skip a chapter that you like, I'm trying to get through this quickly, hurry up, and it's like, okay, I'll read this one, you know. It was a particular quality of 18th century novels, which early 18th century novels, that's the other thing. This is parodying a book. This one is parodying a book, a style of book that would be occurring 100 years earlier than the events that are occurring on Sarah Island in the 1820s. So the 1820s, you're looking at someone writing more like Jane Austen, much more realist narratives, much more grounded narratives, much more cohesive narratives. Whereas what Richard Flanagan is doing is he is parodying early 18th century narratives, so Daniel Defoe in particular. And he's not the only person who's used Daniel Defoe from a post-colonial setting, and that also includes, as we have done on this channel, Foe, which is J.M. Coetzee playing with the concept of voice, identity, and Daniel Defoe with Robinson Crusoe. This one is also doing that. So you have that chapter heading with, this is the things that happen in this chapter. It has an element of, although it has a through line of a narrative, which Defoe novels have, there is always that quality of, well, it's a picaresque. You're not getting great development of character because they remain the same character moving through a load of adventures. And so picaresques are less structured than more modern novels. Jane Austen is not a picaresque. Jane Austen is a very constructed novel. You can't just pick out chapters and read them. You could do that with this. You could read this with that in that way and just use the chapter summary heading to sort of, you know, almost like a menu taster, which is what people were doing in the 18th century. That is why those books are written in that way, is that people would read them in a slightly different way than we do now, because the narratives were less totalizing. And why has he done this? Because he's talking about narrative. He's talking about who owns stories, who gets to tell stories, which makes an 18th century parody a brilliant thing, because they are examining who tells stories. These great autobiographical novels like Robinson Crusoe, like Moll Flanders, who come out at the other end. Billy Gould doesn't come out at the other end in the same way that Moll Flanders or Robinson Crusoe do, and there I am sitting there reading the novel. Billy Gould gets a very different sort of afterlife. He becomes a fish. Specifically, he becomes a weedy sea dragon. A weedy sea dragon who has lived for roughly 200 years to become the weedy sea dragon in Sid Hamet's aquarium, whom Sid Hamet trades places with at the beginning of the novel to kick off this book. So not only is he using parody, is he using the 18th century, he is also dabbling in magical realism. Now, I'm going to leave Janice to explain magical realism to you, because she's going to do a better job of that than I am. But so magical realism is a literary device that has been massively abused recently, being folded in as a variant of fantasy, which it is not. It is a Latin American literary device primarily. It has also been adopted by writers from South Asia and Africa, because it is useful as a post-colonial device to write back to the dominant cultures. It is a form of giving a voice to the people who are inherently voiceless, and a way of infusing indigenous understanding or narrative with the colonial voice. So the magic, the folk tale comes into that dominant voice. It's a really powerful device when used. Australians don't really use it. Why not? Okay. This one does use this. That switch between Sid Hamet and the fish, so that he becomes Gould and views this Gouldian world of Sarah Island, is a magical realist device. It is very lightly touched on. It is not used in the same way that you would find it in a Latin American writer. Janice is going to do those. She's going to explain magical realism a lot better, because this is not my area of expertise. I do Australian stuff. Yeah, we don't use that. We have a very, very highly realist narrative form, especially modern Australian literature, which owes a great debt to Patrick White. Patrick White does a whole load of different things with his text, but magical realism is not one of them. They might be baroque and grotesque at times, but they are still very grounded. This one uses magical realism, and I think that is probably in some ways one of the weaknesses of the book, because we are not a culture that uses it terribly much. I think a lot of people have found this book difficult to read at times because of that. But it comes, I think the reason why it uses this is actually it comes from the influence of another Australian writer who we are not doing, because I really don't like him. That is Peter Carey. And in particular, Peter Carey's books, Illiwaka and Oscar and Lucinda, which use a great deal of magical realism. I think even Bliss uses magical realism, but I've only watched the film of Bliss. I haven't read Bliss. But Peter Carey in the 1980s, 1990s was using a lot of magical realism. And so I think that is where that seeped in. I am not a big fan of Peter Carey. I think that he writes like an advertising man, which I know that sounds like, is that really an insult? Yes, it's an insult. I'm insulting him. He writes like an advertising man. Sort of the same way George Johnson writes like a journalist. I don't think, as much as whatever they're writing about might be entertaining, I find their style very off-putting. So there's that element to this, which I think is very much influenced by the use of magical realism by Peter Carey, which I don't feel works so well in Australia, because this is a book by someone who is a descendant of settler society. That is where this book really, its strength comes from. Not because it is by a descendant of a settler society, but because it is a very unflinching view of settler society. And it's also interested in multiplicity of voices. At the same time this book came out, there were two books, Our Sunshine by Robert Drew and The True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey, that were both dealing with Ned Kelly. And they were both offering alternate views of Ned Kelly, alternate narratives to the dominant narrative of Ned Kelly. So that there's that element of, well, we're going to start telling different kinds of stories, kick against the dominant narrative. Now, kicking against that dominant narrative started way back in the 1960s with Thomas Keneally, which is Bring Larks and Heroes, which we are going to have a look at, because prior to that we had a very Anglo-centric, a very male-centric, and a very triumphal concept of Australian history. And I think the books that would probably exemplify that the most are Eleanor Dark's novels. I can't even remember what they're called. Nobody really remembers Eleanor Dark. I know her house down in Varuna is a writer's centre in Katoomba, and I know she's probably our most famous writer, but she's also very old-fashioned and people don't read her books anymore. I don't even know if they're in print. That narrative is the one that these books are kicking against. When you've had over 150 years of that narrative, starting in the 1960s, starting a little over 50 years ago, about 60 odd years ago, you start to get these narratives coming out. It's a long time now, and we're more comfortable with these narratives, but even, this is a 20-year-old book, so even then, this was coming out only 40 years of these narratives. So he's writing in a revisionist tradition, a postmodern tradition, a tradition that says you can have more than one narrative. You don't have to tell only the narrative of governors and not even soldiers, just governors and explorers and big men like MacArthur. You can tell a story from the perspective of a convict who has left nothing but a group of fish. In Wanting, you can tell the story of a little girl who has left nothing but a portrait in the art gallery or in the museum of a little girl in a red silk dress. This is radical, and it requires taking a look at Australian history that is not flattering, especially if you come from settler ancestry. Now, my forebears, none of them were convicts. They were settlers, but they still benefited from the violence of the convict system and the violence that happened within the settlement of Australia. Why is our narrator a fraud and a thief? Because Flanagan's talking about Australia is that settler society in Australia is based on fraud, terra nullius, and the theft of the land from the Indigenous peoples. And this is the very deeply uncomfortable truth that you have to reckon with if you are a citizen of a former colony, is that this colony in particular, this former colony in particular, is based off a lie, off a fraud, and the land was stolen. And so this is like the original sin that the country has, any colonial country has to reckon with. This and I'm actually really shocked that this book, which is a really good book, okay, it's a really good book. Now, aside from the fact that, and this is a problem with Richard, that is, I think, Richard Flanagan issue, is Richard Flanagan, his vision is somewhat bleak. I always feel that he is outraged that the colonial history that was taught in primary school was a sanitised version, and that we weren't taught the truth, because he's a little older than me, and I certainly know that we didn't do Indigenous people in primary school. We did explorers and Captain Cook and things, and that the true nature of settlement was not taught explicitly. I mean, obviously, by teaching the colonial aspects of Australia in primary school means you're always going to get a sanitised version, which is always a problem, and it's a problem with the curriculum in New South Wales, that we should be teaching some of this stuff older so that we can teach an actual history. And I always get the sense that he's outraged by that. He's outraged that he was not taught the true history of his country, that he was then outraged that when he discovered the true history, that this is what you've been keeping from us, and he is outraged that people are not outraged by this. It is sort of layers and layers and layers of just look at it. While I think that his outrage is incredibly well intentioned, it's a desire to say, look, this is the reality of the country that you live in, to shake people out of the complacency of ignorance, which is, I have no problem with that. It does make his books kind of hard going at times, but he's not pulling his punches. He is definitely saying there are some horrible things that have happened in this country, and we can't look away. Now, I think, speaking about outrage, if we are going to continue the theme of outrage, I am outraged that this thing is not taught on the HSC. I am outraged that a book of this depth, complexity, nuance, technical ability is not, and Australian, is not taught to our children. Why are we not learning this? Why do we not put our own books on our major exams? Why are we looking at foreign books, like and mediocre foreign books? Mediocre. I mean, when you see all the light we cannot see, it's like, oh, bloody World War II again. World War II again, and we have a multi-award-winning man, Booker Prize writer like Richard Flanagan, and we don't put him on the HSC list. Like, that's where I'm outraged. He is outraged that we do not look at our history. I am outraged that we do not read our literature. So I can fully appreciate his outrage. I really can. But I also can appreciate that there is a point at which we don't want to be... people turn off if you harangue them too hard. That is the other issue. I would also say the thing that I don't like about Flanagan, and it's a Flanagan thing, it's not a topic thing, his women are not well enough written. I really... It's a problem that I've always had with his writing, is that I find his women a little bit too much saints and sinners. Not even damned whores and God's police. They're either really awful or somewhat objects of desire, but they're two-dimensional. Whereas his men get a lot more depth and nuance. His women are not. They're either women that the men don't desire or women that the men do desire, which I do think is a bit of a flaw with his writing. But it's still an excellent book. It is a challenging book. It is an interesting postmodern parody. And it is an interesting book talking about whose voices are privileged when we look at history and when we look at narrative. Flanagan in this is privileging the voice of a disenfranchised, condemned convict who left behind a book of fish. This is not the voice that 50 years earlier to this was published in 2002, so 1952, that voice would not have been privileged. That voice would have been hidden. It's only recently, very recently, that people have dug through and been like, oh, I have a convict in my past, and that has been exciting, rather than we hide the fact that our forebears came here as convicts. So it was actually known as a convict stain. You didn't want to have that. It was seen as a generations later, still seen as a social stigma to have convict ancestry 50 years before this book was written. And so Gould's Book of Fish, highly recommend it. Really interesting. Be aware it is a postmodern novel, it uses magical realism, and it is strongly parodied. It is parodying things. So it does take more to read than just pick it up and read it. You need to, it makes you think. It is very much a voice of protest against complacency and ignorance, which, frankly, Australian writers have been protesting about that since Patrick White. So, nothing new there. But, yeah, Gould's Book of Fish. Check it out. And I will be back later on, sometime, to bring you another adventure in Australian literature. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about Carpentaria. We are doing that. It's a big book, and it's a big book, and it is a slow read. It has its own pace, and I'm not willing to rush it. Just especially as as I said, I need to do some work around that. So it is coming this year. It will come this year, but we might have a few other books before we get to Carpentaria. Anyway, that's it from me. So happy reading. Bye bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.